Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me. My name is Dr. Keith McNally. This is the Question Guy podcast. I'm here with Emily Grossman, and we're going to talk about her personal story and why she wrote a book. And we're going to talk about that book too. Emily, welcome to the conversation. How are you doing today?
You. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and I'm doing great.
So let's go ahead and dive into some of your stories. So this is going to be full disclosure. What is what happened to you, really? Just dive in there. What happened to you?
Sure. So, when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and I started having panic attacks after about 2 or so months being in school. And I didn't know what a panic attack was. This was back in 1996, so there wasn't as much awareness of things like panic attacks and mental health struggles in general. And so I felt really like I was kind of, I couldn't go to class. I felt like I was really messing up my life, basically. And so I remember reaching out for some help in school. And little by little, it was discovered that I needed more serious help than a school counseling center could offer.
Okay.
They diagnosed me with depression and anxiety disorder. And so I tried going to a therapist off campus. That even was not enough support. And so my parents made the decision to come down to school and eventually I had to go home.
Okay.
And so that began my journey. I was hospitalized right away when I got home, and that began for suicidal ideation. And that began my journey with bipolar disorder. I had a manic episode, and they diagnosed me in the hospital with bipolar disorder.
Okay.
And so once I was diagnosed, I eventually was able to go back to school, not to Emory, but I transferred to Rutgers because I'm a Jersey girl and all of my doctors were in New Jersey. And I was really, really suffering. The first 2 years, I did really pretty well in school. They had me stabilized on some medication, but it didn't last. And by my junior year in college, I was really going through the worst of things. And I was actually in and out of the psychiatric hospital about a dozen times for suicidal ideation,
Dozen
for
times in a year? How?
no, the between my junior and senior year.
Okay,
So
so kind of within a year's worth of
yeah,
calendar year.
I
Yeah.
would say it's been 2 years. Yeah.
Wow.
And I was trying to graduate at the same time. So I would go into the hospital, come back out, finish my papers, go back in, come back out. So it was a really revolving door situation.
Wow.
And I was able to graduate, but at the end of it, I was really not in good shape. In fact, they were interviewing me for institutionalization in the state hospital. And that was an interview that I am glad I did not get the job for because it would have been really bad. I mean, I was hearing rumors from other patients in the hospital that it felt like jail in the state hospital. And yeah, it was just, it was a sentence. It was more like a criminal sentence than anything else. And so I knew what to say to get out of that placement. And even though I was not really stable in the community, I got out of it.
So you
And
were kind of still feeling disconnected and depressed and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And ultimately, what happened is I was in supported housing, which for those of you who don't know means that I was in a housing situation for people with mental illness where you live with others who have mental illness. And
Right.
I was 23. Most of my roommates were in their 60s with very advanced schizophrenia. And it was a real rock bottom for me. And so I basically willed myself to get a job and worked with a therapist who provided counseling for me, and they adjusted my medications over and over again. I mean, over this span of from 18 until I was about 23, they hadn't gotten the medication right. But finally, somewhere around my 24th birthday, they got it right. And I was able to start work. um, I had 2 different jobs that I lost within 9 months because of symptoms from my mental illness. I would sleep through my alarm because I was over-medicated. I would fall asleep at the desk. So I was by no means a good employee at that time, but that was really because I was really struggling with symptoms still. But I was good enough to work, meaning that I was able to function again in society. So I started to really think about what made me truly happy. And what made me truly happy was teaching. I remembered being a little girl and lining up all my dolls in a row. And we had a big blackboard in my basement. And I felt so good when I was teaching them the lessons I learned from the day in school. And so that really reminded me and made me decide that if I was going to work, I needed to really be happy doing it. So I applied to graduate school because the alternative was suicidal thoughts, and I didn't wanna let that overcome me. So I applied to graduate school. I don't know how, but I got into um, a, a teaching program at Columbia University, and I started my that really kickstarted some of my recovery. I also, while I was there, found a spiritual practice that really made sense for me. And the meditation, I really think, started to repair my mind. And
Well,
so,
what kind of spiritual,
yeah,
so
so
what was going
it,
on there?
it was Buddhism.
Okay.
And I was in grad school and I was talking to one of my friends in class, and I said, one day I want to become a Buddhist. And I
You
don't
just,
know where that came from. It just like fell out of my mouth. I mean, previous to that, I was raised Jewish, but when I was 18, I started seeking out other means of spirituality because I was trying to find some kind of an explanation for why I was suffering so much.
okay.
And, the God of the Old Testament is very human and that human like. He's a he, and he punishes and he rewards. And so I was interpreting it that I was being punished, and that's why I had bipolar disorder.
Oh,
So I needed a new explanation that really was not working for me. And I had spoken to rabbis about it, and it just was not working.
okay.
So when I found so I was in grad school and I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, one day I'm going to become a Buddhist. She looked at me and she said, I'm a Buddhist and there's a meeting tonight and you have to come. And that was how it all started. And there was a group of Buddhists that practiced at Teachers College at Columbia, where I was getting my education. And I started to practice with them. And practice meant we would have these meetings, we would talk about Buddhist concepts, and we would also chant. And the chanting is something we said out loud
Hmm.
and over again. It was kind of like a mantra, and it really started to transform my life very quickly.
Well,
I
what
s-
was this chant? Can you, you said that it was words, right?
Yeah, it was words. Yeah,
Okay.
it's Sanskrit words. The Sanskrit words are Nam, Myoho, Renge, Kyo.
Well,
Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. And we would say that over and over again. Some of you may know Tina Turner, this was her practice. So,
okay. I wasn't aware of that. Right.
yeah, she was a practitioner of the same kind of Buddhism that I practice.
Okay.
So anyway, I started chanting, and I noticed right away I was having conflicts with roommates and stuff, and there were 6 roommates. So it's a lot of women all in one small space.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I wasn't always having conflicts with roommates, but conflicts would come up, disagreements, things like that. And I noticed right away that the chanting really helped to give me an outlet so that I could solve these things in a better way, in a more peaceful way. And I noticed also that my symptoms, more importantly, started to lift. It was remarkable. And so I practiced this way for about a year when I was in grad school and decided to become a member of this Buddhist organization. And, you know, a lot of times for the damage that, because I was experiencing not just mania, which is the high highs of bipolar,
Hmm.
and depression, which is the low lows, and anxiety, but I was also experiencing psychosis, which, for those of you who don't know, that's really having delusional thinking and seeing and hearing things that are not there. And so,
Hallucinations in general.
yeah. And so I noticed that that started to really lift. And I also noticed and went away completely, quite
Through
honest.
chanting.
Through chanting, I was also taking medication.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
So I always stuck with medication because I just had this sense that eventually I was going to find a medication that helped. But it there were not there was not a lot of evidence that that was going to happen. I just had this sense. But the reason I bring up the psychosis is because typically it can really wreak havoc on a young woman's brain or a young man's brain.
Hmm.
And so, like, for example, I was trying to use an ATM card at the worst of the psychosis, and there were too many steps, and I couldn't do it because I was so lost in the thoughts that I just could not focus. Well, when I chanted, it gave me back that focus and started to repair, I believe, the synapses in my brain.
Well,
And, there's been a lot of research on neuroplasticity, or this idea that the brain starts to form new neural pathways when one meditates. And there are other reasons why a brain, it's changing the circuitry. And I haven't conducted scientific experiments on this. And also, I wish they had done a brain scan of the brain I had when I was at the worst of things and then the brain I have now, because I really believe you'd see a different brain, a healed brain.
that would be an interesting thing to compare. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I wish I could have, but I think at the time, I actually asked for a brain scan very early in the process, and they said the technology is just not there, it's very expensive, and probably in 1996, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So anyway, fast forward a little, I graduated from grad school. I then started teaching 6th and 7th grade. And all of my students were great, but a bunch of them had come to me over the 3 years I was teaching with their own mental health concerns.
Hmm.
And as a teacher, I was advised that because I knew nothing about mental illness, I should do nothing except refer them to a guidance counselor. So you can imagine, with all this background I had, I felt pretty helpless.
Mhm.
And so I thought about going back to get a social work degree, but I had taken out a really big loan to go to my first master's program. And I just didn't want to plunge myself into more debt. So I did a Google search, and it turned out there was a program in New Jersey where they were training people to become peer providers. And a peer provider is someone who has lived experience of mental illness, who comes to recovery and helps other people to recover as well. And so I went through the training. It was wonderful and happened to be free. It was through the Mental Health Association in New Jersey. And once I went through this program called Consumer Connections, which I write about in my book, um, I was immediately hired to work in a outpatient facility helping people with mental health challenges to recover.
Good.
And it was I was successful enough at doing it that I made the decision to do private coaching as well, which I have maintained to this day. And this was in 2010. And also, I decided that I was seeing such great results and I was recovering so much more myself that I made the decision to apply for a training job where I could train people, mental health professionals, on the idea that actually people with mental illness can recover. And we see here so much about addictions recovery,
Hmm.
but we don't often talk about the fact that there are people with mental illness who also recover. And I'm one of them, but I am not the only one. But yeah, so that started a 10-year journey in which I became a trainer, and I had different roles in training. And that's what I do to this day. And in terms of recovery, I mean, I just don't have the symptoms I was having. Sometimes I experience some anxiety here and there, but never the kind of depression I was experiencing, that ongoing cloud over your head, you can't function kind of depression. And I haven't experienced mania, and I haven't experienced psychosis, all in about 15 years. And I have not been hospitalized in 15 years.
But just
So,
for clarity's sake,
yes,
you
yes,
still take medication. You're
I
still
do
under a
still.
doctor's
Yes, I'm glad
guidance.
you
Okay.
brought that up. Yes.
Okay.
Part of my wellness is that I take medication, I still have a prescriber, and I still have a therapist. And I
Okay.
do all of that because, that's the gold standard. But what really has helped me to get to a point where I am thriving and not just surviving in my life has been my chanting practice.
Can I ask you a question regarding that, please?
Of course, please.
Do you feel that that chanting and the practice of being in this Buddhist community gives
Mhm.
you purpose as much as it gives you a sense of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? I'll use the word of community again. You are with other people who share the same values as you do.
Yes.
Do you feel that that's kind of part of your the reason that you thrive as you do?
Uh, you know, I always say that when you're around a group of people that are all chanting for world peace, you're going to be around a nice quality of people, and that's something that's a value of mine. I want our society and our world to be more peaceful.
Right.
So I've met wonderful people, and I have a wonderful community of people that all chant for world peace, and we get together and have meetings. So connection is a huge part of my recovery. I have been blessed that I've built a great network locally and just, in general in my life. I'm very blessed with the friendships I have and the
Good,
relationships that I have. Yeah.
good, good.
Yeah.
But in all of this, your book comes somewhere. Where does your
Yes.
book come from?
Yes. So my book, which is called Unlocked: From Psych Hospital to Higher Self,
Wow.
And it's 25 keys to recovery from depression, anxiety, anxiety or bipolar disorder. And so my book, actually, I wrote it about 5 years ago.
Okay.
And when I wrote it, I was really just wanting to give people kind of like a handbook to,
Like in how to. Yeah.
yeah, like a how to. So the book is really my story in more detail, obviously, than what I describe now, followed by each chapter is a vignette. It has a short part about my story, and then it's followed by a key to, to how to use my story to overcome your own challenges. So, for example, there's a chapter about Consumer Connections, which is the organization that trained me in how to be a peer provider. And that chapter is called Turn Poison into Medicine. And so after the chapter, after the vignette part, I talk about how we can use negative situations and turn them into the very thing that not only helps you, like my peer providing life has become, but also helps the world,
Wow.
you know?
That's good. That's powerful. What other parts of your book are you most proud of? So let's talk about all those pieces and how they fit.
Yeah. Excuse me for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I'm proud of or really want to talk about the just the idea that when I wrote this book, I was partially writing it because I wanted to destigmatize mental illness. As we know, mental illness, in our media is portrayed in a certain way. I mean, anytime there is a major criminal incident, like a shooting or something like that, very quickly, um, they diagnose the person with a mental illness. And often it's not just a psychologist or someone who is trained who diagnoses them, but a journalist. So we have all these armchair psychologists who are deciding that people who shoot
Right. We have
people
to give a
in
reason why these people are broken, and that helps us
right
understand their actions,
exactly
but that's not always the case.
exactly and actually people with mental illness are far more likely to be victims than perpetrators of crime, and we know that.
Right.
So I just felt like I wanted to raise my hand and say, I am what mental illness looks like. And in fact, I put a picture of myself on the cover of the book on purpose because, I really wanted people to know that people with mental illness are average, everyday people. 1 in 5 of us has a mental illness
A
in,
diagnosis.
a diagnosis
Okay.
in this country,
Okay.
So yeah, and so I really wanted there's a gentleman named Dr. Patrick Corrigan who I love to talk about. He is from the University of Illinois, and he has done all of his research on stigma. And what he found is that it's not celebrities coming out and sharing about their diagnosis that really transforms things. It is average everyday people that you might know who transform things,
Such as you.
such as me, and I hope such as many, many others. I hope my book really inspires people who have gone through it to also come out and raise their hand and say, this is what mental illness looks like, you know?
So with your training, your coaching, your
Yeah.
book, and what's your mission? So how are you actually helping what I call change the conversation? Because I've actually used that hashtag before and I still use it because many people misunderstand what's going on with people. And unless we have those conversations, unless we educate people on what's really going on, people aren't going to understand. People aren't going to know, but they have to know, like, trust you. And people are stepping up and saying, hey, if you want to know what mental illness looks like, I'm the poster child. But let me talk to you about what really goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, So I guess my mission, if I had to put it in a sentence, is I am here to help people heal by hearing my recovery story.
Good. I
I'm
like
here
that.
to, yeah, yeah. And so I just, when people have been reading my book, what they've said is, this is not just a story for people who experience their own bipolar or depression or anxiety. This can help anyone because it's a true underdog story. It's a true, you're in a dark place, here's how you get out of it,
Yeah.
And so I've had people read it who have just lost a loved one. I've had people read it who, yeah, a few people who have lost loved ones have reported that even though they don't experience the symptoms that I was experiencing, it really has helped them. So,
Well, then let's, as we kind of pull this conversation to a close, let's leave the audience with something empowering because there are people in the
yeah,
audience who could relate to what you're saying, but they don't know the next step to get help. What would be
yes.
that step?
The next step to get help. Well, I really think that the best thing there were a few things that really pulled me out of my own experience. One was, like I said, finding a form of spirituality that made sense to me. So I really encourage people that as much as mental illness is, they've talked about how it's chemical and we're not sure about that anymore and who knows. Um, it also, I really believe, is a bit of a hole in the soul, you know? And what I mean by that is when when someone experiences a mental health crisis, they often, at least in my experience of it and in working with others, they feel disconnected from anything greater, And so finding something, some kind of spiritual practice that makes sense to you, I think is a very important part. Another very important part of the process, and this is aside from the obvious, right? Which is find a therapist, find a prescriber if you need one, reach out for help, call 988, which is the suicide prevention lifeline, which you can call, text, or email. But aside from those things, the other thing I think is really important is really thinking about what your purpose here on this earth is. Because once I found a purpose, and I've seen this for others as well, that questioning of why am I even here falls away. And the, then the healing starts,
Mhm.
And so when I found the purpose that I was here to help people heal through hearing my own recovery story, it really changed the game for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I teach people too. You have value, you're important, and you have a purpose. Emily, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me. And for those of you who are watching and listening, I'll see you next time. Take care.
Hi, everyone.